I talked about the Fifth Pan-African Congress, and I don't want to belabor that again since it's already been discussed. I'll talk about Osagyefo. Osagyefo Pan-African Vision in the African Diaspora. For global Africa, the decades of the 50s and 60s saw progressive challenges to colonialism, imperialism, and racism. And I think we've heard much evidence today about the opening of the doors again and sort of the cross-fertilization of people moving back and forth. In 1954, the United States Supreme Court struck down Plessy versus Ferguson of 1898, in which children of African and European descent in America received so-called separate but equal education. The education was separate, all right, but its facilities, available teachers, materials, and opportunities remained desperately unequal. At the dawn of the 20th century, the earlier 1898 decision had left the majority of African American children ill-equipped to participate in global affairs or to challenge national issues. Then in 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education, Kansas' decision aimed to reverse this educational devastation, stating that separate facilities were inherently unequal and that schools should be desegregated with all deliberate speed. It is now 2010. We see how far we've gotten with that. This legal hammer blow against the walls of American racial separatism, inequality, and inaccessibility paved the way towards greater challenges of institutional racism. This is what we mean by institutional racism. The system just runs on its own. In 1954 also, Ghana attained self-government and was 3 years away from independence in 1957, while the Soviet Union had taken the anti-colonial thunder from America in part because of the latter's blatant oppression of Africans of American birth. Prior to 1954, and right at during the whole era of anti-colonial movement, they looked at the kinds of vicious attack against African Americans in the United States and felt that America had lost its way. They began to turn to the Soviet Union. And this, of course, exacerbated problems because of the Cold War. In fact, as African American historian John Hope Franklin noted, the international impact of the Cold War, the growing influence of the Soviet Union among those seeking an end to colonial domination, and the rapid independence of the African nation states forced the hands of domestic and regional policies in the West. In other words, because Africa was evolving and fighting against colonialism, guess what? The United States felt like the handwriting was on the wall, because if Africa is liberated, you can't keep all these African descendants still under oppression. And so things started loosening up. And so you see that not only internally among people of African descent are things working, trying to reinforce each other, but it's having an impact externally. And Nkrumah's vision of a politically and economically united Africa mirrored the vision of 19th century Pan-Africanists as well. Dr. Nkrumah responded accordingly. His Pan-Africanist vision embraced the diaspora for its role in creating the cultural and political climate in which the movement grew, for its bonds of kinship and shared oppression, which maintain a continuously high profile, for the Pan-Africanist position, and for its role in the future development of Africa and her people everywhere. And 6 years later, between Ghana's independence in 1957 and the signing of the Charter of the Organization of African Unity, now the African Union, diaspora Africans in the Caribbean and the United States drew strength from continental Pan-Africanism. So the shift had been complete. The shift is now back to the continent. Nkrumah's vision of continental unity found expression in the renewed pride and vigor of the 60s Black Power movement. So it's back here again. And in the liberation of South Africa. So you see the things are moving around. Truly, Osagyefo's Pan-Africanist vision maintained the political aspirations of the diaspora while reinforcing its cultural unity. In his closing address before the first All-African Peoples Conference, which was the Fifth Pan-African Congress for all intents and purposes, on the 13th of December in 1958, Nkrumah stated, "I am delighted to see so many people of African descent from abroad attending this conference. We take their presence here as a manifestation of their keen interest in our struggles for a free Africa. We must never forget that they are part of us. These sons and daughters of Africa were taken away from our shores, and despite all the centuries which have separated us, they have not forgotten their ancestral links. Many of them have made no small contributions to the cause of African freedom. Names which spring immediately to mind in this connection are those of Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois. Long before many of us were even conscious of our own degradation, these men fought for African national and racial equality. Long may the links between Africa and peoples of African descent continue to hold us together in fraternity. Now that we in Africa are marching towards the complete emancipation of this continent, our independent status will help in no small measure their efforts to attain their full human rights and human dignity as citizens of their own countries. So there was a recognition that the two were going to reinforce each other. If Nkrumah's call for a united Africa was a threat to European colonialism and imperialism, then his challenge in 1958 to end racialism everywhere shook the pillars of institutional racism and racist policies in the United States and Southern Africa. The resolution adopted at Addis Ababa summit in May of 1963 clearly calls for an end to apartheid in South Africa and racial discrimination in the United States of America. Its second article calls apartheid a criminal policy and American racial discrimination intolerable malpractices which are likely seriously to deteriorate relationships between African peoples and governments on the one hand and the people and government of the United States on the other. In retrospect, it seems that the political challenges which he voiced were far less programmatic than the economic reordering that such challenges entailed. Clearly, the latter required a redistribution of wealth, which was even more menacing than the heralding in of Nkrumah's political kingdom. His clarion call heightened the confidence of global Africans who believed that a politically independent, economically sound, and socially secure Africa would improve their regional situations. And certainly between 1957 and 1965, this was both true and untrue. After the overthrow of Nkrumah in 1961, however, global Pan-Africanism fell into a political hiatus and confusion, while cultural Pan-Africanism maintained a turbulent but persistent presence. African independence, which was the focus of traditional or racial Pan-Africanism, balkanized within the Pan-African movement, with each global African ethnicity, old and new, turning inward towards its own self-survival. Africa's external tribes in Brazil, Cuba, Haiti, the United States, and England were left to tackle their own national liberation as neocolonialism undermined 115 years of African restitution. Neither the continental nor diasporan African can be blamed for this hiatus, but rather a political naivete which Nkrumah warns about in his 1965 work on neocolonialism took hold. He says, quote, "The essence of neocolonialism is that the state, which is subject to it, in theory, independent and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty. In reality, its economic system and thus its political policy is directed from outside." In other words, this is sort of the precursor to what we know as globalism, where transnational companies are now bigger than local governments. And this is what he's warning about in 1965. For the diaspora, the ambiance of international sovereignty created both a cultural and a political dilemma. For the masses of diaspora Africans, the illusion of continental sovereignty meant a renewal of cultural pride and hope that Africa had been restored to her rightful place and that they were coming along with her. For African diaspora leadership, a different crisis emerged. The former comrades became statesmen and stateswomen, creating a gulf within global Pan-African leadership. In other words, Nkrumah, before he became a statesman, had more engagement with the masses than Nkrumah could as a political leader. And that was both in his own country of Ghana and outside in the diaspora, which had supported him. And this was one of the unintended consequences of supporting this change in leadership that nobody had really thought through clearly. And it happened all over the continent. On both sides of the Atlantic, an illusion of political power within the African continent and an illusion of economic power within America came into being. And this is, of course, the evolution of the black middle class. This is what leads Du Bois to overthrow his own talented 10th theory. He says it's not going to happen. These illusions, coupled with the reality of their mutually economic dependency on the West, demanded an international focus which sacrificed more of the global Pan-African mission. This schism also meant that of necessity the political, cultural, and economic struggles which had defined a more global Pan-Africanism since its inception turned inward towards question of race relations, ethnic survival, civil rights within one's own backyard, rather than among the disparate sons and daughters of Africa and the continental Africans themselves.